Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar S.O.S. Cuba, the Significance of Protests on the Island, organized by the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University. My name is Jorge Duani. I'm the Cuban director. I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute, at Florida International University, and I'm happy to serve as the moderator for today's event. This event is co-sponsored by the Cuban Research Institute, the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy, the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy, and the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series. Before we begin, let me remind our virtual audience that you can submit questions during and after the panel in the Ask a Question, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I will combine as many of these questions as possible and then post them to the panelists after the presentation. Let me say a few words by way of introducing the topic and the discussion. On Sunday, July 11, thousands of Cubans took to the streets to demand libertad, freedom, and to express a widespread discontent with the Cuban government, chanting "down with socialism" and requesting, indeed, demanding the resignation of current President Miguel Díaz-Canel. People also repeated the refrain "Patria y vida," fatherland and life, popularized by a rap song by Gente de Zona and other Cuban singers that went viral last February, denouncing the repression and economic stagnation under the Cuban government. The street protests started in the town of San Antonio de los Baños, near the capital city, continued in Palma Soriano, in the eastern province of Cuba, and quickly spread to more than 50 sites across the island, including Santiago and Havana. The mostly peaceful demonstration featured a large number of Cubans, many of them of young age and African origin, who were born and raised after the revolution, in fact, born and raised after the 1990s, as well as people from all walks of life, occupations, and perhaps ideologies. Not since the popular manifestations of El Maleconazo near the waterfront of central Havana on August 5, 1994, have there been such massive and outspoken expressions of discontent with the Cuban government. Compared with the 1994 demonstrations, the current wave of protests has involved many more people, has reached the entire island, and was largely coordinated and documented through social media until the Cuban government decided to crack down on the internet on Sunday afternoon. Now, we've asked a group of experts to address some of the multiple questions raised by this dramatic and unprecedented set of events, including the following. How did the human rights situation trigger the street protests in Cuba? What is the historical significance of the July 15 events, which continue to a lesser extent today? What was the role of the coronavirus pandemic and the economic recession in creating this expression of public discontent? How has the Cuban government responded to the growing number of political, economic, and health grievances articulated by many of its citizens? What is the role of the Cuban American community in supporting and articulating the protests on the island? What are the policy options available to the Biden administration and other political actors in the United States? And finally, how have other governments around the world reacted to the Cuban protests, particularly in Latin America, but also in Europe? I'm pleased to introduce now our panelists. Unfortunately, one of the members of the panel, Professor Darío Moreno, won't be able to join us today. First, we'll hear from Sebastián Arcos. Sebastián is the Associate Director of the Cuban Research Institute at FIU. He holds a master's degree in public administration from FIU, and he has been a member of the Cuban Community for Human Rights and the Freedom House delegation to the UN Commission on Human Rights in Geneva, as well as an advisor to the U.S. Department of State concerning human rights in Cuba. Our second speaker will be Astrid Arrarás. Astrid is teaching professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at FIU. She earned her PhD in political science from Princeton University. Their areas of expertise include Latin American politics, democratization, and political development. Next, we'll hear from Martin Paluz. Martin is the director of the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy at FIU. He received his PhD in international law from Masaryk University in the Czech Republic. He is a former ambassador of the Czech Republic to the United States. Last but not least, we'll hear from Carlos Aladrigas. Carlos is the chair of the Cuba Study Group, a nonpartisan policy and advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. He's also the chair and CEO of the Regis HR Group, a professional employee organization. Carlos holds an MBA from Harvard University. Now, I've asked each speaker to speak for about 10 minutes in their initial presentations. Then we'll open it up for discussion with the audience. And as I said before, I'll try to compile as many questions as possible from the audience once we hear from the four of them. So without further ado, I give you my colleague, Sebastián Arcos.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to try to be very quickly running through three fundamental questions. One, what happened, although Jorge has already advanced a lot of that. Second, why now? And third, what's next? What we witnessed last Sunday on July 11 is simply unprecedented. There is no comparison of anything similar, not even close, since 1959. These demonstrations were completely spontaneous. They were not organized or coordinated by any actors. They just spread like wildfire through the internet and social media from one town to the next, all over the island. More than 40 cities and towns had some sort of demonstration beginning that Sunday. A profile of Cuban society today was present in those demonstrations. They were young and all. They were black and white, and especially the women and younger Cuban played important roles. I have seen videos that it's just amazing how brave Cuban women were during the repression against the demonstrators. It's just amazing. These demonstrations were not grievances for economic issues or local governance issues. They were openly politically radicalized against the regime. The chants were freedom, down with Diaz-Canel, down with communism. It is very clear that the Cubans have now a different perception of how to change their circumstances in Cuba. They were peaceful. There was no violence against elements of the government. They were only isolated cases of property destruction. We have all seen the police cars upside down. But I think they were exemplary, peaceful overall. These demonstrations represent the breakdown of an important psychological barrier that is common to all totalitarian societies. The belief that the population cannot demonstrate against the regime publicly and that it would be futile to do so. This barrier was broken on Sunday, and it was broken for good. It remains to be seen if the government perspective on how to react next once this phase of repression is over has also changed. That's important because the population sent a signal of where they are to the regime, and the regime has to react accordingly. It is, without a doubt, a watershed moment in the history of Cuba. And from now on, Cubans will no longer celebrate 26th of July, 26 de Julio. From now on, they will celebrate 11th of July, el 11 de Julio. Why not? Well, the regime has a very long history of systematic violations of human rights, basic, fundamental human rights. I will list them, but they are just too many, and we don't have the time. They were largely ignorant to these rights that were taken away from them until the very early development of a human rights movement in Cuba in the late 80s that slowly but surely made sure that Cubans understood what the phrase human rights was about, what it meant. And I can say that one of the proudest moments in my life is to have been a member of that group. Osvaldo Payá, one of the most famous Cuban dissidents, had a phrase that he used a lot and became very popular. The phrase went like this: we Cubans have rights to human rights. So they now understand what this is, and this played an important role in what happened. Of course, there's a deepening economic crisis. The crisis is not new. Cubans are not new to economic crisis. This one is particularly bad, and many Cubans today in the island say that it's worse than the special period after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is compounded by a health crisis, crumbling hospitals, lack of medicine, and of course, COVID. On top of this, the Cuban government, who has bragged for decades to have one of the best medical systems in the world, has handled this in a very incompetent manner. And on top of that, Cubans are aware that the regime is exporting Cuban medical doctors and exporting vaccines instead of delivering them to the Cuban people. Then there's the connectivity issue that made this possible. Cubans are now able to bypass the government's controls on information. They know what is happening in the world, and they know what is happening in the town next door or in the town across Cuba. This played an important role, definitely in this, and it will play an important role in the future. This didn't happen in a vacuum, of course. For years now, there have been smaller, isolated demonstrations, public demonstrations against the regime, led originally by dissident movements like Ladies in White and others. These demonstrations became more and more common. Recall the one against Diaz-Canel while he was visiting the town of Regla a couple of years ago. It led to last year San Isidro and the N27 movement and the demonstration before the Ministry of Culture. I think these all created the momentum for what happened on Sunday. Last but not least, the government is in a growing crisis of political legitimacy. They don't have the political legitimacy of those who came down from the mountains. The population doesn't believe what the government says anymore. They don't believe the narrative anymore. They don't believe they have any right to tell the population that they have to sacrifice any more than they themselves sacrifice. This crisis of legitimacy is, I would say, the most fundamental factor, because it was the one that broke that psychological barrier that allowed Cubans to go out into the streets. If you don't believe in the government, if you don't believe they have the right to be there, then you believe that you have the right to go out into the streets and ask for their resignation. What comes next? Well, to begin with, I believe demonstrations will continue, perhaps not tomorrow, not next week, or not next month, but people will go out into the streets again, because the underlying conditions that created this movement, this explosion, will continue. And they will continue because that barrier has been broken for good. It cannot be fixed. The government cannot change that. And it will continue because the regime's nature itself is against doing the profound structural reforms that the country needs and that people demand. They have clearly demonstrated they are not willing to move in that direction. So people will go out into the streets again. And then what happens depends on that clash between the two forces, it seems unfair because the government has all the advantages, but we cannot underestimate the power of a population out into the streets. And whatever happens will depend on that clash and that dynamic of the two forces confronting. There are several alternatives. The government, the leadership could fracture as a result of continued increased demonstrations. Once the regime leadership fractures, then there are more options. There could be a negotiated solution as it happened in Poland or in Hungary. There could be a regime collapse, peaceful collapse as it happened in in Czechoslovakia and in East Germany, or there could be, hopefully not, a violent regime collapse as it happened in Romania. Two things I want everybody to take away from these events. The most important, in my opinion, is that this psychological barrier was broken for good and it cannot be fixed. The genie cannot be put back in the bottle. That's number one. Number two, equally important, is that what we saw in the streets in Cuba and in the streets of Miami this week is that there has been a generational shift, a generational relay. Younger people have taken the cause of freedom and have made it theirs. And they have demonstrated that they have the passion and that they have the interest. And I think it demonstrates that the torch of the cause of freedom has been passed from one generation to the next. Thank you, Jorge.
Thank you, Sebastian. And now we will hear from Professor Astrid Arraras.
Yes, thank you, Jorge. And thank you to the organizers of this event for inviting me. I'm honored to be in the company of these distinguished members of the panel. And I'm delighted to know that we have a wonderful, fantastic turnout. We have many people listening and watching us today. My role today would be to talk more about what has been the response from Latin America regarding the protests in Cuba and how the Cuban government has responded to the protests. The recent protests in Cuba have received diverse responses from governments, opposition parties, and leaders in Latin America. And these protests and responses from the Cuban government also have implications for domestic politics, not only in Cuba, but also in Latin America and also inter-American relations, U.S. Latin American relations. So my brief comments today will be divided mainly in two parts. One will be making comments on 4 types of responses from Latin America regarding the Cuban protests and the Cuban government responses. And also I will point out some implications, and I will relate my implications to what Sebastian just mentioned. Let me talk about the first part. The first part will be the 4 types of responses. These 4 types of responses are the following ones. One is those who are against the Cuban government and in favor of the participants of the protests. A second type of response will be those who are in favor of the Cuban government and criticize the problems of Cuba to the U.S. embargo. The third type of response will be those who are on the fence, like middle ground responses. And the fourth type of response are those who remain silent. Silence is very relevant, it's very significant sometimes. So let's start with the first type of response. Those who are against the Cuban government and in favor of the participants of the protests. These are the governments of Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Uruguay. Let me start with some of the comments that they have made. President Bolsonaro from Brazil, he called for freedom and criticized the repression by the Cuban government. He was one of the very few leaders who made the link between Cuba and Venezuela, blaming partially some of the problems of Cuba to the Venezuelan crisis. That's very significant because other leaders didn't mention Venezuela, but he did. Also, we have from Colombia, President Duque. He said that the Cuban people are calling for freedom to choose a democracy. So again, in favor of the protests. Piñera from Chile, he defended the rights of people to protest. Sagasti from Peru supported the right of people to express themselves in a free and peaceful manner. And Lacalle Pou from Uruguay praised the courage of the Cuban people who protested against a government that he described as a dictatorship that does not respect human rights. Besides these presidents from these countries that I mentioned, we also have Juan Guaido from Venezuela, who has been recognized as the legitimate president of Venezuela by different countries. And he supported the pro-democratic movement in Cuba. And he said, "We are united in the struggle to achieve freedom and democracy." So for Guaido, as well as for Leopoldo Lopez, that I'm going to mention soon, they see the struggle in Cuba as the struggle that they're experiencing in Venezuela. Leopoldo Lopez, supporting what Guaido says, he claimed that the protests are a signal of hope for those who are fighting to put an end to the dictatorship in Venezuela. And he says what happens in Cuba affects Venezuela because these two dictatorships fit into each other. So as you see, these two leaders from Venezuela, opposition leaders, they are watching what's happening in Cuba because it's related to their struggle in Venezuela. In civil society, we have in different parts of Latin America many Cubans, supporters of the Cuban people who were protesting. They organize protests, demonstrations. We have seen them in Ecuador, in Peru, in Colombia. So we have a diaspora in other parts of Latin America that are supporting the protest. So that was the group that supported the protest and criticized the Cuban government. Now let's move to the second type of responses. Those who are in favor of the Cuban government and criticize the promise of Cuba to the U.S. embargo. These are the governments of Argentina, Bolivia, Mexico, and Venezuela. And let me start, of course, with Venezuela. Maduro, President Maduro gave unconditional support to the Cuban government, to Diaz-Canel, and to the revolution, and called for the end of the U.S. embargo and the sanctions. In Mexico, President López Obrador, he didn't say anything about Diaz-Canel. He didn't say anything about how the government is responding to the protest. He just offered help with food, medications, and vaccines for COVID-19. But he condemned the American embargo and the intervention of some organizations that allegedly are being paid by the United States that are intervening and destabilizing the situation in Cuba. López Obrador claims that we have to let Cubans choose their own destiny. But as I mentioned, no comments, no criticism to Diaz-Canel, to the Cuban government, how they're responding to the protest. So that was a very interesting position. Argentina, which is the president of Argentina, President Fernandez, he agreed with Mexico, with Manuel López Obrador, and he called for an end of the embargo. And no comments on the responses of the Cuban government. In Bolivia, the President Arce, he supported the Cuban government. And in Nicaragua, of course, Daniel Ortega blamed the American embargo to the problems that the Cubans are facing, and claim that the U.S., the United States, is the first destabilizer and destroyer of the planet. And his wife, even claim that the Nicaraguan people supported the Cuban government. Also, we have comments from President-elect Pedro Castillo in Peru that he said that his government will protect the sovereignty of Cuba. And the protests, according to him, are legitimate, but everything should be solved internally. We have to let the Cubans solve their internal problems. And of course, again, like the other members of this group that I just mentioned, he called for the end of the embargo. The left in Latin America also, and when I mean the left, it's the left that it's maybe former guerrilla organizations that have become political parties, they all have supported the Cuban government. And what I mean is the former FARC in Colombia that now is a political party, and the FMLN in El Salvador. There's a third type of response of those who are on the fence. And this is like the middle ground position. And I thought this was a very interesting position. And I couldn't find many examples, but I found one. This is the Socialist Party of Chile, that they call for the end of the American embargo, but, and this is interesting, ask the Cuban government to listen to the demands of the Cuban people and recommended a dialogue to solve the crisis, not to use repression, to talk. I thought that was very interesting. So it's a middle ground position. And then the last type of response, and I think I'm running out of time, but I'm doing well, is those who remain silent. And I thought that was another interesting position. Here, I found the example of President Bukele from El Salvador. As you all remember, in May 2021, this year, Bukele undermined democratic institutions by dismissing Constitutional Court judges and the Attorney General. As a result of his actions, there were protests in El Salvador. And these protests were faced with repression. So Bukele is quiet. He's not saying anything about what's happening in Cuba, because how is going to defend the protests in Cuba in the name of democracy and freedom when he's undermining democracy and he's repressing protests? So it's interesting how he's remaining in silence. Well, the second part, and this will take 1 minute because I think I'm running out of time, is related to what Sebastian says, what's next? And these are the implications, because all eyes of Latin America, and not only Latin America, the whole world, are in Cuba. What's happening in Cuba? What is happening? What are the lessons that can be drawn from the Cuban experience at the present time? And so it's a learning environment for Cubans, but also for Latin Americans, because we have to look at why people are protesting. What are they claiming? What sources do they have? What tactics are they employing? I'm glad that Sebastian mentioned the social media, how it's an important, and now it's out of the control of the government to a certain extent. How is the government responding? How long can they repress? What are the implications of continuing repression? How can the international community, and I think Martin here is going to talk about this, how can the international community respond to these events? And it could be organizations or countries, non-governmental organizations, and what could be achieved and what are the challenges that are ahead of Cubans and other Latin American people who want to continue the struggle for freedom and democracy. The answers to these questions, that I don't have them, but I'm just posing them, and I think they're related to what Sebastian mentioned, will offer some lessons for Cubans fighting for Patria y Vida, as well as for other Latin American people who are also fighting for freedom and democracy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Arraraz. And now we will hear from Martin Paluz.
Thank you, Jorge, very much. First of all, special greetings from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, because my first comment is, this is not only a Cuban issue, it's not only a bilateral issue with the United States and Cuba, it's transatlantic issue, and certainly it's a global issue at the same time. First, just to specify my own position. I've been involved, and it's known fact, now in my capacity as director of Warsaw Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy at FIU, in Cuban issues for ages, for decades. But always I need to emphasize one thing. I'm not Cuban, and Cubans have to resolve their issue themselves. I fully respect here the rule of non-intervention into domestic affairs of other states, other nations. I'm a spectator, engagé, engaged observer, someone who is not just observing from his academic perspective what's going on here or there, but I'm engaged. But I am trying to find the right form of my engagement in this situation. And let me to explain it more in detail and more carefully. First, I fully agree what has been said, and especially Sebastian made a clear point. It is not this moment only about some concrete issues that have maybe triggered the protests last Sunday. It's about a reunification of Cuban nation. It is a moment in which Cubans need to look back at their history in the 20th century and to ask themselves what can they do to be a nation they would like to be a part of. They need to go back to the questions of Jose Marti in the last decades of the 19th century, what Cuban nation is all about. And I feel that now, obviously, demonstrations were or have been taking place not only in Cuba, all over the island, but in Miami, and Cubans around the world are excited because they feel that there is something in the air. It's not just this particular issue, the shortage of something. It's a question of Cuban identity and Cuban future. So in having said that, what is the role of international society here? It can be only auxiliary, for sure, because Cubans have to make their own decision about their own future. That's what I have already said. I fully stand by this statement. But international community play quite important role here. And let me to use, I have written a long piece about that, so I can send it to you later so that you can read it. Something about my Geneva lessons. In between 1999 and 2001, when I was head of the Czech delegation at the meetings of the Commission for Human Rights in Geneva. Commission doesn't exist anymore. And it was a diplomatic exercise. Just for the record, the year before, 1998, because of the intervention of the new president of South Africa and this body, the U.S. Proposed resolution failed. So this effort, driven by the Washington power, was defeated. So Castro's government thought that it was over, that now we don't need to take care about these matters. I was approached by Cuban dissidents, both Entro y Fuera Isla and Czech Republic decided to bring ball back to the game. And just to make the long story short, we won this game 3 times in a row, in spite of the fact that it looked like a mission impossible. It looked like something that could not be done, because parties to this cooperation, I called it Bermuda Triangle, Europeans, Americans, and democratic countries of Latin America had a disagreement. I understood the disagreement because of the difference of historical perspective. It was about economic, language, or U.S. embargo, or the relationship between the economic aspect and international human rights. And the only thing we could do to make it happen, to win this game, was to keep all the partners, all Democrats involved, in spite of the fact that they were different in many, many ways. So in this moment, I would like to state loud and clear that the way how the situation in Cuba now is perceived in Washington and in Europe is extremely important. The differences are here, we understand that, But the question is how we can work effectively together to help Cubans achieve their goals. So this is it seems to me that this is the most important aspect of our international operations. That the international community can only create an enabling environment for the Cuban deliberations. And certainly, I understand the government in Cuba is now trying to understand what's going on. But we need to help Europeans and Americans and Latin American Democrats to understand that this is not only a Cuban issue, that it is about the future of democracy in the world. Because it seems to me that there are so many skeptical voices today when you hear something what the future of democracy is. Liberal democracy is challenged in many quarters. And the question is, do we have a positive example, a country that really can make a positive and successful transition from dictatorship, from failed economic system to something better? And listen to me carefully, I think that Cuba is the best shot. Cuba is the country that can prove that the future of democracy is still with us. So I think that Cubans need to understand that this is not only about Cubans, it is about Cubans. I understand that this is their first concern, but they have this type of global challenge at the same time. How can this be done? I think that certainly Cuban dissidents, as we used to be in our time, need to be prepared for the moment. One thing is that now we have more people coming to the street. You have this gray zone, as it was called in our times in Czechoslovakia in the years leading to 1989, that was joining a small group of dissidents and trying to be part of the public square. Cuban opposition, in my view, needs to have a clear plan. What we are going to do if things start to change in Cuba. And I spent some time now communicating with Czech government last day and with the Czech also Senate, because obviously everybody tries to have his or her own position in this situation, and trying to explain exactly that. Europe is a big challenge for Cuban Democrats, but it's doable. It is something that can be done, but it must be done by wise steps in cooperation with open-minded people in Washington. Now, I think that everybody understands that status quo is unacceptable, that some sort of change must happen. And the question is how and what form of this change will take place. What the change will shape up. I think that the presence of the past, the capability of Cubans to look back, understand themselves in the context of the decades that we have behind, and a future-oriented vision is extremely, extremely important. So I can guarantee to you that if we are able together to disseminate a Cuban message which means strive for freedom, not just some temporary solution for the shortages of this or that. It's extremely important. I think that if we hear the voices from Cuba, extremely important is that it is young generation. I have the honor to teach at FIU. I communicate with young Cuban Americans, and I can tell you that they are patriots. They feel that this is their identity. And if something can be done on our side to boost it up, to have some sort of effective communication, cooperation, we can make a tremendous difference. I spent some time communicating with State Department, I was in Brussels, and I'm trying to find out how we can help. We do have an obligation to help. We have a chance to help. But the first thing is Cubans, and they need to have open ears and creativity. I'm so happy to see Sebastian Arcos here, because Sebastian is history with his family and the tradition of non-violent, la resistencia non violenta. And I think that now we have a chance to make it, and we don't want to miss this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And now Carlos Rodriguez.
Yeah, thank you, Jorge, and thanks to all the members of the panel. It's truly a privilege to be here with you and to share the importance of the moment with you. One benefit of being the last is that I get the benefit of all the wisdom and all the interesting things that everybody has said. So that gives me an important point in which to couch my comments. I would like to start by talking a little bit about what are the lessons of what happened here and what are the important lessons for us, because clearly it is very important to be happy and to be very upbeat and very hopeful as to what's happening in Cuba, because as Sebastian said very clearly, this had never happened before in Cuba in the recent history since 1959. So this is incredibly important. But we need to understand, we owe it to ourselves to clearly understand what happened, what caused what happened, and what are the implications of what happens to the future. Because we cannot, as Cubans on this side of the straits, we cannot afford to mess it up. We have an incredible, important moment that we need to seize, and we need to get it right. And quite frankly, I don't know of anyone that possesses the whole truth, including myself. I certainly would be the first to recognize that. But this is a time to listen, to keep our ears open, and to try to really understand what has happened here, and to take actions that benefit the future of Cuba, not actions that set us back. In many, many ways, and I like to refer to the song Patria Vida, where Yotuel says that llevamos 60 años con el dominó trancado. We have been 60 years with the domino game at a standstill. That is fundamentally important. That was told to me last night by a friend of mine. We had dinner and he brought that up. He said, you know, this is incredibly important thing that is there. What we need to make sure now is that now that el dominó se destrancó, because the Cuban people in the streets of Havana and all the other cities in Cuba where this happened, it was truly nationwide. What this happened is destrancar el dominó. Now, what is important for us and the challenge for us here in Miami is that we do not become the ones que tranquen el dominó de nuevo. Extremely important. We need to ensure the continuity of this process, the strength of this process, protect the integrity and the genuineness and the authenticity of this process, and let it grow and develop into its own future. That to me is very clear. I concur with Sebastian that the most important thing that happened here on 7/11 is that it shattered the myth that the Cuban government wanted people to believe inside of Cuba and outside of Cuba that this couldn't happen there. Well, it did, and it was big and massive. And that's incredibly important. However, what I think is important is also to understand that this is not, as some people are characterizing it here, the beginning of the end. This is not the beginning. The beginning of the end, if you wish, happened on January 1, 1959, because a system like that one that was being established over the long term was not a sustainable system. So that was truly the beginning of the end. But there were other moments that were incredibly important here. And that is what I saw and what I draw as a conclusion for what happened here on 7/11 and thereafter is the fact that we are seeing openness vindicated. We are seeing what engaged people with the world can do. We are seeing what people with communications among each other and with the outside world can do. We are seeing how civil society empower what they can do. So I would caution that one of the most fundamental lessons here is, please let us not argue that we ought to go back to the periods of dark isolation of Cuba. That would be the gross possible mistake that we can make. Let us reciprocate with increased opening, increased access to technologies, increased information, increased contacts, and so forth. I witnessed during the Obama administration, because I participated in many of the meetings, and the Cuba Story Group, along with the Council of the Americas and Brookings Institution, launched about 10 years ago or 11 years ago, the first Internet Summit for Cuba. We witnessed the involvement of companies like Google and many other companies involving the internet and social media, and the development of the things in Cuba. If you look at the fact before that opening to technology and communications, there were very few telephones in Cuba, cellular telephones in Cuba. Very few of them had mobile internet capabilities. And now there is hardly a Cuban citizen who doesn't have a portable cell phone capable of internet and so forth. And we saw how that helped the movement in terms of their communicating with each other. Very important, and Sebastian, your family, as Martin mentioned, is key in this. We need to keep this movement nonviolent. You know, it is important to sober a little bit and to understand, if we look at the work of Professor Chenoweth, Erica Chenoweth, she pointed out recently that only 34% of the mass movements, of the pro-democracy mass movements over the last 10 years were successful. That means that the rest were not. So we have to do everything we can to prevent this moment from fizzling out. We have to keep it alive. We're not the only ones that need to do that. Cubans on the island need to do that. The international community need to do this very strongly, and now more than ever come together, but we need to keep it alive. This is incredibly important, and that requires continued openness, continuous engagement, and continued presence from the Cuban Americans on the ground in Cuba, and continue to engage with our brothers and sisters in bringing about the changes that Cuba so desperately needs. So any effort, whether by the United States or by anybody else, to turn this movement into a violent movement would go against the very core. You know, in many ways, as Professor Chenoweth argues in her paper, the market for violent movement has dried up in the world. Nobody has an appetite or a desire to see violent movements. So we need to ensure that we keep this movement nonviolent. And of course, U.S. intervention would not make it a nonviolent movement, it would make it a very violent movement. So something like that, we need to think clearly, and we need to be clear-headed as to what it is that we need to ask the U.S. government to do and what it is that we do not want to ask the government to do. Having said that, there are some concerns. You know, why these many movements have not succeeded? In part because the internet, just as it is a force for good, it also has a dark side that we have seen and witnessed in this country, that has helped create the divisions that we brutally have seen divide this country in half over the last few years. It also, governments have become much more adept and sophisticated at surveillance and repression. One of the arguments that I remember dealing with back in those days in the last year of the Obama administration is whether the embargo allows Cuba to buy from US the technology that it needs to implement technology equipment. We noted in our paper that the embargo did not allow for that equipment to be imported. And part of the results of that is that Cuba ended up buying all of that technology from China. That's a despicable fact. So let us not repeat, and I'm not suggesting that how we made it available, they would have bought it from us. Of course, I'm not suggesting that. But buying Chinese technology, if you want internet freedom, is the worst thing you can do for the freedom seekers. So that would be very, very important. Where do we go from here? And as I said, this is a unique moment. It's a moment of inflection. It's a moment where every Cuban American needs to think, what have I done before? Is it right? Is it wrong? Should I be doing more of that or less of this or more of that, something different? It is a time to reflect. It is a time to say, you know what? I may have been wrong all along. There is a better way. Show it to me. We need to open up. We need to open up our minds, open our hearts. And as Martin called us to do, we need to come together in solidarity. We have differences. That's what a democracy is all about. If we didn't have differences, how can we believe in a democracy? But we need to come together in solidarity of these people and help them, help them continue to have the hope. At the end of the day, it has been said many, many times that demonstrations and mass movements that we saw are not driven by hunger, are not driven by material necessities. They are mostly driven by shattered dreams. And when the youth of Cuba, and by the way, we all noted in the protest that it was overwhelmingly represented by some of the poorest members of Cuba society and by some of the youngest members of Cuba society, when their dreams are shattered and they don't see hope for their future, that's when they seek their rights to reclaim that from their governments. So as we sit here, let us work together to get the international community to come in solidarity with the United States to declare diplomatically the Cuban government as a pariah. And then let us open the door to change. We cannot prescribe how that change needs to take place, but I can assure you that how Cuba changes is as important or more important than the fact that it began to change. This is incredibly important, and that's where we need together to find good solutions and effective measures that can help our brothers and sisters on the island. Thank you.
Thank you all for your insightful and thoughtful presentations. We have more than 20 questions on our Q&A, so I will proceed now to ask some of them. And of course, if you feel like that question pertains to your presentation, feel free to come into the conversation. So we have a question from Victor Maruri, who wants to know about the role of decentralized economy and why, unlike Russia, China, and Vietnam, Cuba has not been able to decentralize its own economy without an abrupt change of government. So the question is why? Any thoughts on that?
If I may a short comment. I think that it is very clear that freedom and successful economy is two sides of one and the same coin. So I think that if we want to imagine some sort of communication with those in power in Havana right now, they might be interested in economic improvements. But I think that the message must be very clear that any economic improvement, especially in the case of Cuba, should be, I would say, reflective on Cuban opportunities, potential, and mentality. That's why I'm talking about the reunification of Cuban nation. I think Cuba has a tremendous economic potential, not a Chinese model, not a Vietnamese model, but Cuban model. And Cuban model can be only successful if all parties may be trying to think about some sort of confidence building measures, do the right things. I'm thinking about the independent Cuban farmers. I can just go through the list of concerns of Cuban economists, direct foreign investments, and I can go on and on. So if they want to improve the economy, I think that the essential thing is freedom and a reunification of Cuban nation, and international community should create an enabling environment for that.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes, go ahead, Carlos.
I provide a bit of an answer here to Victor. You know, I was in Cuba several years ago, invited by the church to give a presentation in the Salón Félix Varela of the Centro Cultural Félix Varela in Havana. And it was packed with people from dissidents. I remember Giovanni Sanchez and her husband were there, and, you know, as well as high-ranking communist and party members were there. So it was a very diverse audience. One of the things I said is that Cuba is poor, not by destiny, not by being the victim of the US embargo and so forth. Cuba is poor by design. Okay, and it is poor by design because poverty and making people dependent on the state for their livelihood is one of the most effective forms of controls that a totalitarian system can exercise. And this is why, having seen China evolve into an oligarchic capitalism state, and Vietnam and others, Cuba has refused for years to make similar reforms, because for them, they have value when they have put it on the scale. They have value the benefits of managing poor people versus the risk of losing control, political control. So they are the ones who are afraid of the linkage between wealth and political ability. They are the ones that have created this linkage, and they're the ones that have managed this linkage through the years to keep people poor. So to me, it's like honing on this and making it the centerpiece of our strategy to deal with this repressive government in Cuba is to, in essence, continue to give this government what they want. To me, that just doesn't make any sense.
Thank you, Carlos. We have another question from Daniel Sixto, which I think is probably in response to Sebastián Arcos's presentation. So the question is, even though the Cuban government has largely lost its legitimacy among the population, has there been any figure to rise as a potential alternative to the regime? Is there any set opposition that currently presents a threat to the regime? Sebastián?
The short answer is yes, there have been many. There are many. They are not strong enough to challenge the regime and defeat the regime, even if there was a chance for an open debate or an open confrontation. Cuba is a police state. It is very difficult to be on the opposition in a police state. But the names are there, and I mentioned Osvaldo Payá, and there are many others. And I'm going to go back into part of what I say. The best thing about this is that when I started in this business 30 years ago, there was a small group of people, mostly in Havana, mostly men, mostly white. And now it's everybody. It's a cross-section of Cuban society. And the leaders are younger, and the leaders are darker, and the leaders are female, and is a wonderful multiplication of this. But remember, it's a police state. It's very difficult to coordinate, very difficult to create something larger, similar to what happened, for example, in Poland. Poland has its own characteristics that are very unique. It cannot be replicated in Cuba. So we will see eventually the development of an opposition table or some sort of umbrella group that will be able to challenge the government more effectively. We have to allow for that process to continue to develop. And the way to do that is to help them achieve that.
Thank you, Sebastián. Here is a question from Ricardo Perez for Professor Astrid Arraraz. He writes that he understands the suggestion for dialogue between the protesters and the Cuban government came from the Chilean Socialist Party, which I think you mentioned. But in the case such a demand comes from the protesters, how do you envision this dialogue? can be realized in the absence of a leader or a recognized group?
Yes, so if I understand, it's how difficult it is to have a dialogue when we don't have a leader among the people who are organizing the protest, right?
Yes.
Yes, so that is a challenge, and I agree with you, Ricardo. And I go back to Sebastian. Sebastian, who will be the person? Who will be the spokesperson? Who will be the leader of the Cuban protester? Can they identify? Can they come together and identify a common leader that can help them? Because if they do, that will really facilitate the dialogue between the Cuban government, between the protesters, and maybe between also with international organizations or international actors that also want to support this process. So that
Yes.
question will be back to you, Sebastian. And
Yes.
thank you, Ricardo, for the question.
There was a similar group, a similar umbrella group back in 1996 called Concilio Cubano that united all kinds of different groups under one collective leadership. Of course, it was disbanded by the government through repression. It is sadly connected to the shooting down of the Brothers to Rescue planes, which occur simultaneously. And we have seen another example, much more recent, in the November 27 demonstration in front of the Ministry of Culture, where you have a spontaneous group of 500, 600 people gather in front of the minister, and they selected their own leadership who would represent them when they met with the vice minister eventually later that night. They selected their own leadership. This is a fluid process, and it's something that can work and will work. But of course, we have to remember that we're talking about a police state. They don't want that to happen. So they will do everything they can to prevent that from happening. But it can happen, and it will.
I will
you,
throw a
Sebastian.
very
Yes.
provocative idea to this discussion. Obviously, I have a tendency to compare the Cuban situation with our Czech experience. We had Václav Havel, and he was then seen as an uncontested leader of the opposition. Maybe Cubans don't have that type of person at that moment, with all due respect to all important figures that are on the list. But Cuba has a much stronger exile community. And I think that if something strong, and it doesn't need to be personalized in any phase, comes from Miami, that it can be a very effective tool of communication. Because obviously Cuban government now, I think, is in a difficult situation. They know that they want to protect their police state, but they know that the consequences of doing that can be tragic and even very catastrophic. So the question is, who can be a serious partner in, I would say, pragmatic communication?
Thank you, Martin. Here's a question from Ana Diego that I think Carlos may be interested in responding to, and perhaps Martin. She writes, a nonviolent transition is what we all hope for, but the current dictatorship is not going to give up the power that easy, and they're the first ones to use violence and repression. So what can the international community do to support the Cuban people when that time comes, or to prevent that from happening? You need to turn on your mic, Carlos. Yeah.
There we go. Do you hear me now?
Yes. Yes, I can hear you.
Unfortunately, one of the things we need to understand is that the ability to change Cuba from without is limited. Whether it's the Miami community, the Cuban American community, the exile community, or the United States, or the world community, it's limited. What we can do, all we can hope to do from the outside, is to create as good a transitional environment to facilitate the processes of change, and to denounce and virulently oppose diplomatically any further escalation of violence by the Cuban government. And that's exactly what we should do. That's exactly what this multilateral alliance should do, to pressure the Cuban government into recognizing that it is unacceptable to escalate the violence. And of course, Cuba has been under an arm embargo for a long, long time. So yeah, normally I would say impose an arm embargo, but that doesn't apply to Cuba because they get their weapons from friendly countries. So that unfortunately will not work. But that continued diplomatic pressure, Cuba is a small country. Cuba doesn't have the depth that China has and so forth. It is more susceptible, significantly more susceptible to political situations around it, to their relationship with the countries and so forth. And that gives pro-democracy seekers an upper hand. It gives them some leverage in the process. This is not going to be an instantaneous process. And I think we have to get that out of our minds, because if we expect that this is going to get resolved in a day, look at the courageous Venezuelan people. How many mass demonstrations have they done over the years? Significantly larger than what happened in Cuba. And they're still fighting and still struggling for change. So we need to think of this as a process. And what we need to be is very smart about what we ask governments to do, what we do ourselves in making sure that we capitalize on these things effectively. You know, I was talking to Father Jose Conrado today, and he mentioned the work of Mary Douglas, the famous anthropologist, and he actually mentions her in his book, in his most recent book. And Mary Douglas said, and I thought it was a unique phrase, it says, el único modo en que puede darse una transformación en el seno de la cosmología dominante es por medio de un cambio a nivel de organización social. So what she's saying is that the only way you can have a significant transformation is through a change at the level of social organizations. This is what a civil society does. This is what people empower to work on their own, self-employed or whatever the case may be, that they don't have to depend on control by the state and so forth. This is what artists who are all of a sudden independent of a state control. By the way, this movement started with San Isidro. That was an artist-led movement that has culminated into this protest to a significant degree. It is that level of civil society openness and engagement that we need to continue to nurture and promote and help develop strongly, in my opinion.
Look, here is, I think, a big challenge for the European Union and European governments. They have decided, in the context of the bilateral agreement to be implemented with Cuba, to engage Cuban government. So I think that now, in the current situation, they should be very clear to remind Cuban government there is a suspension clause in the agreement in the case of, I would say, violation of certain basic principles on which this agreement is premised on, which is human rights. So if Cuban government is deciding to go against their opponents, I think they should be given a very clear signal from all parties, including the Europeans. And Europeans should be more creative, trying to, I would say, accommodate the policies with the bigger goal, and which is freedom for Cubans and prosperity for Cubans. So I think that it is now something that needs to be taken very seriously into consideration by international players. I understand that Cuban opposition is not always effective in getting together. You know, you have so many unification efforts, and still we don't know how it's going to evolve. I fully respect that, but I think that all international partners should now find their way how to help this process, how to send the right messages to the Cuban government. And
key messages to the Soviet Union and to China, Martin. I think one of the things that a coordinated international community can do is to send a very strong message, because one of the risks that we have here is increasing interference by Russia into the Cuban situation. the international community needs to band together to send a clear message to China and Russia that we will not accept increasing interference in the affairs of Cuba, that we need to let the Cuban people sort this out by themselves. This would be, in my opinion, a very important message that a coordinated international community can achieve far better than what the United States can achieve on a standalone basis.
Thank you. Here's another question from Ada Artusa Young, and I think Sebastian and perhaps Astrid can address it. The question is, how feasible is it to provide internet connection from the outside to Cubans on the island so that they communicate with each other and coordinate and be aware of what's going on all over the island and ultimately maintain a united front? Sebastian?
Jorge, I am not an expert on technology. I'm actually part of that generation that is not particularly good with technology anymore. And I don't know the answer to that question. I have read that there are technologies available right now. One of them includes balloons that might beam and create wireless spaces. It was used, by the way, in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, but it was easy because Puerto Rico is a smaller island and you could actually put the balloons on top of the island. You cannot do that in the case of Cuba. It would be a violation of sovereignty and have all the consequences. I don't know if it can be done. I hear people say that it can. I agree that it would be very important to do it because, in my opinion, I'm a child of the Cold War. I see the internet in the same role as Radio Free Europe had during the Cold War in Europe. Information is gold. We have to help the Cubans to be able to reach that information and then make their own choices.
I agree, but we have to be careful that we don't waste a lot of time on pipe dreams. And quite frankly, as from what I know on the issue, and I'm not an expert either, I want to clarify that, but the technology per se is not available. There is this limited capacity to use balloons to transmit to small places for a temporary period of time, but that requires devices on the ground that can accept this transmission. It requires integration with the SIM card of the telephone that people have. That, of course, is not feasible in Cuba. And besides, Google closed that division, that balloon division. Google closed it the beginning of this year or the end of last year. So it's closed down. There have been efforts. I know a fellow Cuban American who lives here in Key Biscayne that had negotiated a deal to take fiber optic to Cuba. That was blocked by the government and the Treasury Department because of the U.S. embargo, so that couldn't happen. Then a company called Liberty Global has been trying to do certain things too, looking at ways of doing it. The most promising thing that we have right now is a dream of Elon Musk, the founder of SpaceX and Tesla and all the things. He's talking about putting together a huge international network of small satellites that can create a complete internet web that is totally independent of wires or other devices. But at best, this will become somewhat of a reality in about a year or two. It needs to pass a lot of regulatory hurdles. So there are a lot of issues here. Meanwhile, all is not lost. You know, there are proxy servers, there are VPNs, and many things that people in Cuba are now using that can help break this bloqueo del internet that the Cuban government has imposed. And ultimately, as we said in that internet summit, governments adopt internet, authoritarian governments adopt internet, not because it helps the people be free and more independent, because it helps and is necessary for economic activity. So witness China. Why does China have such a thriving internet? Because they need it for economic activity. So what the Chinese government and others do when they have wide internet is they become very savvy at blocking internet access and interfering with sites and surveillance of people and so forth. So the whole internet thing is a dance between pro-democracy forces and oppressive forces, and it's a question of who outdo the other over time. And that game will continue. We haven't seen the end of this game, and we will not see it for a long time to come.
Astrid, do you have any thoughts on this issue of internet?
No, oh, sorry, no, not at all. I think my colleagues have said everything that more than I could mention. So thank you. I'm sorry for my technical limitations on this topic.
Thank you. Okay, so turning to another question from Gabriela Hernandez on our Q&A. She notes that in order to keep her family healthy, she's unable to participate in protests in Miami. So I guess it's an open question for the entire panel. What other ways can we, meaning the Cuban American community, support the Cuban people from here in the US? Sebastian?
There are many ways where individual Cubans can help. There are a lot of independent civil society groups in Miami that deal with the Cuba issue on a day-to-day basis. They need volunteers, they need funds, and I think the best way to help is to join one of those groups and work with them. I'm not going to mention any particular groups because I don't want to seem partial, but there are plenty to choose from.
Yeah, also, if you're going to, somebody highlighted, it says, what an irony that this mass protest in Cuba, the majority of the people were overwhelmingly wearing masks. Compare that to what happened at the Freedom Tower in Miami the other day, where hardly anyone was wearing a mask. We created another potential mass transmission event. We need to be careful.
Carlos, if you don't wear the mask in Havana, they put you in jail.
Well, I agree, but still they did. They were protesting the government anyway. They were going to go to jail anyway, and they did it. So it's important. It is okay if you take your own precautions. It is okay to participate in some of these demonstrations. You know, keep your mask on, clean your hands often, and so forth. And yes, because those demonstrations are also very important. Very, very important.
If I may, I think it's extremely important, and I label that project the presence of the past, young generation, and I fully agree with Sebastian. Now they are taking more active, having more active role in the discussion about the Cuban future. But to absorb the history of Cuba, it's a challenging task, and something that has been effectively used by Castro government for decades. So I think that, and this is, I'm going back to FIU, I am in touch with young 20 years old Cuban American students, and it's so interesting to listen to their stories. And obviously our responsibility is to put these stories into certain larger context. A larger context has political dimension, is a matter of Cuban collective identity, Cuban history. So I think that here, it looks like we want to focus on future, but the past is extremely important. And we need to find a way how to get to some sort of reconciliation, catharsis, some sort of knowledge based on what happened in the past. And it seems to me that here Miami can play an extremely important role, because obviously Cuba is still quite difficult place for, I would say, this type of discussions. And Miami, if it can lead here and communicate with the island, first thing I would love to see again is restoration of normal communication with Cuban dissidents who used to be coming here in larger numbers in the past. And if I were something to recommend to Biden administration, just do anything possible to open this, I would say, free communication.
That's right. I agree.
Thank you. I want to turn to another question by Nicolas Prados, who is a PhD student from the University of Oxford. And he asked, what I think is an intriguing question, How significant is the fact that the protest began in towns and small towns and rural places like San Antonio de los Baños or Palma Soriano, rather than the capital or the main cities? And how stark is the rural-urban divide on the island?
Let me start. There's a stark urban divide in Cuba. It's a very urban society to begin with, as it was 60 years ago before Fidel Castro came to power. However, the level of investment by the regime in the last 60 years outside of Havana has been limited. And there's an ongoing joke in Cuba that says that Cuba is Havana and everything else is landscape, which is, of course, an exaggeration, especially for people who were born in those little towns outside. But it gives you an idea of how stark the difference is. The government has invested only in the larger cities. Obviously, Havana is the place, and that explains why so many people migrate to Havana from the provinces. Is the best supplied, is where you have less blackouts, electric blackouts. And the same is valid for many other aspects of daily life in Cuba. I think police presence might have been a difference also. Police presence in Havana is extensive. It might not be as large in those smaller towns. San Antonio is on the small side, but Palma Soriano is not so small. It will be an interesting sociological study to find out exactly why it happened. But it went from the less urban to the capital, and not the other way around. And that's a very interesting question to look at.
I think the most striking, from what I could see, because I haven't seen any statistics on this or anything, but from what was visible on the television and the social media images, the most significant divide is the socioeconomic divide. I think it was clearly, overwhelmingly, the poorest people in Cuba that came out, as opposed to the wealthier elements that you would see in Havana and in some of the larger cities. So more than anything else, even beyond racial, I think it had more to do with socioeconomic status than anything else. But I agree, more work needs to be done on this to understand it better. So we will find out over time.
Thank you. I want to ask Professor Arraraz if she can comment on the role of Nicaragua and its response to the Cuban situation. There's a pretty long comment here on the Q&A by Marisa Reyes. I won't read it, but just your thoughts, perhaps, if you can elaborate on the response of the Ortega Murillo regime.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Marisa, for your question. And I didn't read your comment, but this is what I know about Nicaragua's response. Daniel Ortega and his wife, Vice President Murillo, they both were very vocal, and they really emphasized their support to the Cuban government and especially to Diaz-Canel. They were very eager to express their support and to let the world know that Nicaragua was in solidarity with the Cuban government. I'm not surprised by their response at all, because the three main countries that have been very consistent in their support towards Cuba have been Venezuela, Bolivia, and Nicaragua. They have been consistent in their support to the Cuban government, for years, for decades. So I wasn't surprised by their support. It's interestingly that they are supporting the Cuban government and they are supporting a government that is repressing protests when they are leaders, the vice president and president of Nicaragua, who are undermining any any rights or freedom of people. Nicaragua, as you know, is an authoritarian regime, and Daniel Ortega is staying in power forever and ever, like the Castro brothers had, and like Maduro had, and of course Chavez too. So I don't see any surprise by Daniel Ortega's response to the Cuban government and to the protest. It's very predictable. Thank you.
Jorge, if I may add very quickly, the repression in Nicaragua was more brutal and more lethal by far than what we have seen in Havana or in Cuba, as bad as it is. And I think the Cuban government has had plenty of time to learn how to deal with mobs in the streets, with protesters in the streets, through the examples of Venezuela and Nicaragua.
Okay, thank you. We're running out of time, but let me see if I can place a couple of additional questions before we end. This question is from Iraida Lopez for Sebastián. And she wants to know about your claim that Cubans will be celebrating July 11th instead of July 26th from now on. What evidence do you have for making this claim, given the relatively small number of people who actually participated in the protests?
Okay, I don't have a crystal ball. I cannot assure that this is going to happen, but I think it will happen. Of course, those who are Cubans understand the meaning of 26 de Julio and what it celebrates. By the way, one of my uncles was at the Moncada with Fidel Castro and was wounded. So I have a dog in that fight. There were not small numbers of Cubans out in the streets. There were very large numbers of Cubans. How many? We don't know. How many do you need for them to be enough to have the kind of weight that you want to assign it? Look at Venezuela, 28 million people. I am not sure there were 1 million Venezuelans in the streets at the same time. At some point or another, there were hundreds of thousands, absolutely. We don't know, again, how many were out in Cuba, but there were a lot, thousands of them. Eventually, we will find out. I think estimating the strength and the magnitude of the opposition in Cuba to the regime by the numbers of people that go out at any given time is misguided, because we are not dealing with an open society. We are not even dealing with an authoritarian regime. We're dealing with a totalitarian regime that rules through terror. So when you see 10,000 people out, that means that you can multiply that a number of times, because the actual number of people who agree with them is much larger than the ones that you see out. It's kind of a fallacy to try to estimate opposition based on the number of people that actually go out into the street.
Thank you. So we're about to end the conversation, unfortunately. We have a lot of questions, but let me sort of pose a general question that I see in the question and answer button that I think might end this some way, which is, what do you think are the current policy options for the United States facing the future of Cuba? And we might begin with Professor Arraraz, and we only have a few minutes.
Yes, a few minutes. Thank you so much for the question. That question was bothering me, or you know, I was thinking about it. The Biden administration currently has a big challenge, which is how to respond to the Cuban protests, to the Cuban government, how to respond to the Cuban Americans in the United States. And I really like Carlos's point about, I strongly believe that it's not time for intervention, for invasion. This is not the moment to call for that at all. This is the moment when the Biden administration should find options, should reach out with the different sides and try to establish dialogue and support, solidarity, like Martin was saying. That will be my advice for the Biden administration. No intervention, no violence, no isolation either. No, isolation is not good. Just accompany the process, support, listen, facilitate dialogue between the sides. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin, do you want to say something?
I would be very clear. My heart and mind is on the side of Senator Bob Menendez, because I think that he is a great Cuban and he is sending to the Biden administration clear message. Engagement is important, but engagement that has clear goals stated. And clear goal is future for Cuban people, which means freedom and prosperity, dialogue that can bring people together and not to keep the status quo that have been here for 60 plus years in place. So I am 100% of the side of the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate, Bob Menendez.
Thank you. Carlos?
I concur, but I am somewhat less optimistic that we can get there. Discarding 60 years of a failed policy and all the elements that are there is not going to be easy. It takes too many forces to come together at a time when they're not going to do that. So the options that Biden will have are limited by definition. And we hope he focuses on the things that we have talked about, opening up the ability to travel back and forth to Cuba so that all those citizens in Cuba can continue to come back and share with us experiences and some of the newer ones too. I mean, we now have a whole different universe of protesters, dissidents, and so forth. Let them start giving them more international exposure. That would be fantastic. Deal with the humanitarian crisis in numerous ways, and there are many ways to do that. But perhaps the most important message that I would give the Biden administration is please don't go backwards. Don't go backwards. Let us not retrench. The worst scenario that can happen is that the Cuban government goes into the bunkers and closes down the hatches, and America retrenches back into a policy of isolation. Let us not allow that. As much as people may want it, that is not the way to do it. And international cooperation. Let's get the international community for the first time ever, especially Europe. It's going to be very difficult, as Astrid mentioned, to get Latin America behind. But let's get Western Europe behind us here in solidarity, in coordination, to call the Cuban government what it is and what they're doing, to put pressure on China and Russia to not intervene in this thing. And then let's open up to the Cubans and provide Cubans with openness and be attentive to science from within. Change is not going to come, most likely, change is not going to come on a wholesale basis. Most likely it's going to come on a retail basis. And we need to understand that retail changes over time build to bigger things. And we need to welcome any changes in the institutions, any changes in the civil culture and the organization of civil society in Cuba, and let those things flourish, and let the Cubans do it on their own. Let us not take away their agency and their moment to shine. You know, some people say we did that back in the War of Independence. The United States did that back in the War of Independence. They stole victory from the hands of the Cubans. We cannot afford that to happen again.
Thank you. Sebastian is going to have the last word.
Thank you, Jorge. It's kind of unfair because I started. But I have an important point to make. And I think we cannot rely entirely on one policy or another, because both sanctions and engagement have their roles, and they can be combined in one smart policy that uses the best of both in order to encourage change. I don't agree with Saladiga's belief that you can build a civil society under the noses of a totalitarian regime. I don't agree with the retail approach. That's not the way it has happened elsewhere. When change came, came wholesale, pretty much wholesale. And most important, it avoids the trap created by the regime's propaganda that everything is the fault of the United States, as Cubans say, el totí tiene la culpa. We have to avoid that trap. And we have to approach this in a smart way. So going back, by the way, Carlos, you can also go back to unconditional engagement, which was Obama's policy, and it was not effective because it was unconditional. I think there is a way to combine both approaches and achieve what we want to achieve, but there are certain limitations that we will face, and one of them is trying to leapfrog over a totalitarian regime that understands very clearly that their remaining in power depends entirely of their control of what comes in to Cuba. So they will always control it. And that's why we don't have Google, we have China infrastructure in Cuba, because that's the one they selected, that's the one they wanted. We cannot force them to buy something, they buy it if they want, right? So let's try to balance the approach. You know, too much stick doesn't necessarily work. We know this for experience. And too much carrot doesn't work either, because we already tried that. And I think part of the reasons pushing these demonstrations out into the street was the deep disappointment of young Cubans before, in the face of the failure of the Obama engagement, not because of the Obama policy, it was generous, although it was naive, but because of the regime's reluctance to move despite the change on the other side. And I think it's the result of the nature of the regime. They are who they are, and only the Cubans in the street will change them. It will change the equation. People on the streets will change the government's equation, as it happened all over the world.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we ran out of time as usual, but let me also mention before we close that there will be a recording on the CIPA YouTube channel. You can go into their website and find out exactly where that recording will be if you want to listen to the entire thing. And thank you to everyone who participated, particularly the panelists, Astrid Raraz, Sebastián Arcos, Carlos Rodriguez, and Martin Paluch. And this concludes today's event. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.